Welcome to OTT Talks, a series of conversations with think tankers, policymakers, and experts around the world. This episode is part of a series of discussions with European think tank leaders to reflect on the nature of their work in a rapidly changing continent. My name is Enrique Mendizabal, and I'm co-hosting this session with Goran Buldioski. Today, we have the honor of having Mario Holzner with us. But first, Goran, why don't you set the scene for our discussion today?
Thank you, Enrique. We're really pleased that we are entering in the fourth season of these interviews. We already had 11 episodes, really excellent conversations with the various think tank leaders across the European continent. Now, for this series, we decided to do something a bit more specific. We thought that it will be really great time to speak to leaders of economic think tanks, and these are a bit of a special type of organizations because across Europe, both East-West, but as well North-South, they have a longer tradition. Also, not only as independent centers, but as well often linked to state institutions and academia. And we thought it will be really interesting to have a separate series with directors of economic think tanks. With that, Enrique, I get back to you to introduce today's guest.
Thank you, Goran. So after this introduction to the series and this particular podcast, let me welcome our guest. Mario Holzner is the Executive Director of the Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies, WIIW, where he has worked for 25 years, and the center is 50 years old. So that is quite a run. And with 50 years, the center is one of the most reputable economic think tanks in Central, East, and Southern Europe. It has focused on macroeconomic developments and structural change, international economics, labor markets, and social issues, as well as the selected issues related to sectorial and regional economic developments. And Mario has worked on a number of these topics, lately focusing on issues of infrastructure investment in Greater Europe, proposing a European Silk Road. Mario, welcome to On Think Tanks.
Thank you so much for having me.
Let me start by trying to set the scene. We expect many of our colleagues in think tanks around the world will tune in and listen to this interview. And it's useful if we can begin by briefly describing the political context in which your organization operates. And yours might be a dual context, and you're based in Austria, but you work in the broader region. But to get us started and to be a bit light in the way we start, let me ask you this question. If your country was a film, what film would it be?
I would even say that we are actually not only in two, in a way, territorial layers, but actually four. I would say.
Okay.
There is also the European Union. There is a global context. So it is one that I think that fits very well to the classical movie that deals with Vienna, and that's The Third Man. It plays basically after the Second World War, and the character is, let's say, he's kind of dealing with issues of structural change, both the society, the economy is changing a lot. The status of the country is unclear. There are international powers that are around, a crazy world that we are living in today, and that I would claim in Central, East, and Southeast Europe was always a little bit more crazy than in Western parts of the continent.
And we move away from the film to the actual reality. But because Central, Eastern, Southeast Europe it's a big space as well, right? And I guess it's very diverse within. Can you maybe describe that context in which we are today?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very heterogeneous space. Historically, it was overlaid by the Habsburg Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, and fragmentation has developed after the First World War, and then obviously after the Second World War and the Holocaust. On top of that, you have then the Soviet Union and communism that somehow takes over the region with a also very distinctive economic setup of central planning. Although again, even within communism, you had very different sorts of communism. Central planning was not central planning everywhere the same. And even there existed communist countries like, for instance, Yugoslavia, where my mother comes from. Hence, she's from Zagreb. I speak also Croatian. That's in a way also the way how I came to the Institute, dealing with this post-socialist space that was already within communism very diverse and is continuing in many ways this diversity and heterogeneity in economic, social, political terms. But as always, very much under the influence of global economic, technological, and geopolitical developments.
Thank you, Mario. That's actually a very a good background, and I love the movie. That's one of the classics, and I love the fact that in Vienna you can still see the movie. It's shown almost regularly. That's really, with Orson Welles, a real classic. You described actually quite succinctly and eloquently the various changes, including, we are connected with the fact that we both come from a former country, Yugoslavia, that doesn't exist anymore, and so many different changes. What's interesting when we look at at your think tank, I mean, first it's interesting you come from Vienna, and where let's say the dignitaries such as Hayek, the paramount figures of the free market economy came from, while your center has not taken a very explicit ideological grounding in any of the Vienna-based economic ideologies, as it were. But of course, with those times and those changes, I'm sure that your think tank's economic analysis, value framework, policy advice evolved in response. How do you assess the relevance and positioning of the economic analysis and those values propositions that you have today, as opposed to the times in the past?
Yeah, I think we were always very pragmatic with regard to the analysis of the economies in Central East and Southeast Europe. We have and had the privilege to have various, very diverse economic opinions at the Institute. There are really all kinds of, if you call them ideologies, present, different theoretical backgrounds, very much also related to the fact that the Institute is made up of people coming from the region with all their past experiences in different phases of the development of that region. So we had, for instance, a former scientific director of the Institute, Kazimierz Żurawski, who was a Polish emigre of Jewish origin, who fought in the Warsaw Uprising, who later on in the anti-Semitic cleaning of the communist Poland was forced to leave the country, and he came to Vienna, and he was a scholar of Kalecki, basically the East European Keynes, who at the same time as Keynes developed more or less the same more demand-driven theories of economic thought. He was also a mathematician, so his problem was rather that he was publishing in Polish and in French and not in English, and so he didn't become as famous as John Maynard Keynes, but very similar theoretical background. And so Professor Żurawski was influencing, obviously, the Institute a lot. But on the other hand, later generations of emigres from the region who came in the 80s, who experienced the end of communism, and they brought rather economic liberal ideas of market and so on into the Institute. And I think we had the intellectual pleasure to combine all kinds of theories, which for various analytical purposes have their merits and in some cases also lack some depth. So you have to combine, I think, the analysis, but definitely while basically the mainstream was saying, look, we just, in transition of the region in the beginning of the 1990s, we just look at supply side economics. We said, look, wait a minute, there is also something like demand side. There are political consequences of economic and social processes. Please think about that. Unfortunately, that was not the zeitgeist of the time. Very radical market-driven solutions were chosen with all the political repercussions, I think, that we have to bear today. I think particularly about how the transition process was mismanaged in Russia, for instance, and the outcome of an oligarchic structure and so on. So with all the tragedies of the people that were born around transition, these are, you can measure the effect. They are about 1 centimeter shorter than people who were born later or before transition in the region. Economic policy has a huge impact on the life of so many people all around the world. And I think we're also speaking about industrial policy, for instance, at a time when this was a no-go word in the mainstream. And now everyone is speaking about industrial policy. So there are certain certain things you can learn, I think, from Central East and Southeast Europe. It's like a laboratory. Things happen much earlier here than in other places. Not always, happy things, but I think it is an interesting area to do also comparative research with what we do. So we are not focusing just on one country, but we are actually comparing them. We are looking what are the similarities, what are the differences. I think it's an advantage to analyze economics in general.
It's very interesting, Mario. Every time I sit through one of these interviews, I reinforce this idea that I have that there are huge similarities between sort of parts of Eastern Europe, Southeastern Europe, and Latin America, more so than we think about often. You've talked a little bit about the role that your institution has played in this context, but I wonder if you can reflect a little bit on the role and the broader role that think tanks have played, or the changing roles that think tanks have played in the last 10, 20 years in the region.
Yeah, I mean, particularly in Austria, I would say you would have a whole lot of think tanks which are maybe more like a little bit like pressure groups, that have a very clear political alignment, that are not just like our institute is a non-profit organization that is serving basically a global public. Everything that we produce, all our publications are online. Everyone on this planet that has access to internet can read our, so to speak, public goods that we produce. And we are, in a way, responsible in that sense also to the broader public. We don't follow a specific political goal in that sense. We have obviously opinions. We are very much, I think the majority of colleagues in the Institute are, for instance, very much for European integration, for the whole idea of cooperation instead of conflict. I think that is certainly goals that we share at the Institute. But yeah, there are now a lot of other players all around, not only in Austria, if you look also in Hungary and so on. Dozens of institutes have been founded that have maybe less of a general public good purpose, but that were created to support certain political parties and their pressure groups. And so that is something that I think has changed, particularly in the last 15 years in Central and Eastern Europe. Obviously, that happened much earlier in the United States and in the United Kingdom. So everything comes a little bit later in terms of institutional development to this region. But that is something, a reality that we face. And there's obviously also fight for resources, if you wish, coming from the state authorities.
And is this appearance of these new type of think tanks, is this putting a pressure on your own organization's strategy, for example? And so we see this happening in other contexts, right, where these organizations are getting a lot more attention from the media. They're getting a lot more attention from political leaders. They're getting a lot more attention from politically driven philanthropists. And there's pressure often on the more, as we want, technocratic, more sort of middle ground, more pragmatic think tanks to do something about it, right? Either become a little bit more ideological, a little bit more combative, or double down on their approach to stay down the middle of the road.
Yeah, there's definitely an issue because, I mean, obviously, if you are working for an institute that has a clear political goal, then, I mean, your whole communication is very different. You are almost, your purpose is to find radical opposing opinions. While our purpose is to look at research questions that are important for society and see what particular statistical data says. So we are very much data-driven. And if the outcome is what it is, well, that it is. And we will try to base our policy recommendations from the data that we are analyzing. There is an issue, as you said, that also the logic of media is becoming an ever more polarized logic of having very strong sentences, opinions, one number to put everything into a specific context and so on. And this is difficult for us, let's say, old school institutions to deal with. So our, in a way, luck and problem in the Austrian context is that we are not dealing with the Austrian economy, really. only at the margins, only in the sense that what does the development in Central East and Southeast Europe mean for the Austrian economy, for the European Union economy, and so on. Yeah? So we are not in the arena to fight national politics, but we are in the arena when it comes to the attention of funding from state resources. And then the question obviously is, well, and there was, I read from the news many, many years ago, from the media, I read that there was a minister who allegedly didn't know of our existence, has never heard from us, and was of the opinion that something that she has never heard about doesn't need any public funding. So we had troubles with trying to say, look, I mean, we are very much known, particularly outside Austria, maybe less so within the country. And that's also where we understood, well, we probably have to do also something with media, because so far we were just waiting, journalists were coming to us, we were not like actively trying to sell anything. So we are certainly adapting a bit to the logics of media, I think, yeah. And also if you look at the newspapers and so on, I mean, they have cut huge amounts of jobs of people who before were really doing a lot of research, and so partly we have to take over also functions of media to actually put things into neat, small, digestible messages, to have publications where there is an abstract where you immediately know what it is about without reading the rest of the paper, where there is a nice figure with one number that can be quoted easily. So these are all things that we have to think about, and we also employed a colleague who is actually responsible for external communication.
Yeah. So I'm going to jump in my sort of list of questions, because you mentioned the funding challenge, and you spoke about one aspect of your funding, which is public resources, right? I think different public institutions in Austria. But I understand the other part of your funding comes from projects, I'm guessing from a range of actors. Could you tell us a little bit more about that aspect of the funding, and also how you try to maintain a balance between both sources and what you do with those two types of sources of funding?
Well, traditionally, when I started a quarter century ago at the Institute in the Southeast Europe project as just an assistant researcher, the subsidies provided to the Institute were more than 2/3 of the revenues of the Institute. The traditional subsidy providers of the Institutes are the Ministry of Finance of Austria, the Austrian Central Bank, the City of Vienna, and some of the social partners in Austria, which is a special corporatist structure of Austria. So basically, a very broad group of different political backgrounds. And so, I mean, in that sense, that is not a bad structure to have as subsidies support from the broad public, but also with the global financial crisis, the austerity packages that came later on, and so on, the difficulties of the public sector to cope with all the perma-crisis and to deal with the resources at hand. The outcome was that the subsidies were by and large cut by some subsidy providers, or what the typical way is to reduce in real terms the subsidies is just to not correct for inflation. And if you look at the inflation that was over the last years, I mean, that is like de facto in real terms a cut if you don't compensate enough for those things. So we were basically forced to do much more on the project side, basically provide our experience, our expertise, our policy advice to international organizations. We're doing projects for organizations like the World Bank. We are running for money in all tenders of the European Commission that somehow deal with the topics that we are dealing with. So apart from the regional focus, we are dealing with macroeconomics, much EU fiscal policy issues. We are dealing with international economics, so trade, investment, and so on. We are dealing with labor markets, with all the issues relevant for the region, migration, demographic change, automation. We deal also with subnational, regional analysis, with industry, sectoral analysis, with health economics more recently. So we have basically real economy topics that we can offer. And in recent years, apart from these international organizations and international institutions, We have also more and more customers coming, or cooperation partners coming from the sphere of foundations, German, American foundations, that in a way replace to a certain extent state-related organizations in the funding of public goods, basically, research that has no commercial market, so to speak, but is there for a global society to consume and to develop political alternatives to current developments.
Yeah, I mean, that's Mario. I have a lot of questions. You already spoke about some of the things that you've done well and how you've sort of reoriented you as well, where you need to improve, especially on the communication and not expecting. Sometimes I feel the economic think tanks and many others are like the modern consumers of electronic goods. You know, in the past you go to a shop and then there is an expert and explain you which fridge and which TV you need, and now you have to do the research at home, and then an intern will simply just tell you what's the price of it, or you will buy it online. It doesn't work that well when you don't have, you know, journalists that know economy that will go deeper and whatnot. But what are the other, I have two-sided questions. What are the other sort of things that you've done well over the time? I mean, obviously you've reoriented, obviously you've managed to weather the change in the funding environment. Perhaps something else on the research side, and were there any other challenges that you now, when you look back, you'll say, I wish we would have done something differently?
Yeah. Well, I mean, first of all, these are not my solo decisions. We have a tradition of very collaborative decision making, which has pros and cons. Obviously, we might be in some cases a little bit slow because we try to establish a certain harmony, consensus on many things, but it has also a lot of advantages, I think. There's also in Austria this corporatist tradition I mentioned before, so cooperation between management and workers' council, which basically any even smaller organization needs to have, is really ingrained in the fabrics of this society, and I think it makes a lot of sense to come to terms, to think about what could go wrong, what could go well, is maybe a little bit something that Austrians are not so much thinking. So it's rather they think what could go wrong, which is very helpful. It's good to know what can go wrong. But seizing the opportunities is maybe not so much a Central European thing. So that's where we are very happy that we attract people from basically all over the world. We have a lot of people, obviously, who come from Central East and Southeast Europe, but we have also colleagues coming as far from Iran, Colombia, France, Italy, but it's really quite a diverse group, and people are bringing in experiences also. A deputy director from the United Kingdom bringing in also institutional knowledge of how things are done in the UK, for instance. I think that helped us a lot to develop various strategies to cope with issues that are there, and not starting from scratch all the time, but having really good ideas of how to move forward, how to have a better impact, how to bring our message out to the world. And we are extremely happy that, I mean, partly it's also obviously luck for us, bad luck for others, but I mean, obviously some events like the war in Ukraine, I mean, make it clear to a wider public that there is an importance of doing analysis of economies in Central East and Southeast Europe and in all of Europe, and in a comparative way to look at what could be affected, what are the effects of price changes, of supply chain changes, and so on. And we are regularly being quoted in the Financial Times, in The Economist, in the big important newspapers, also in Germany, obviously also in Austria, but beyond just the national boundaries or even regional boundaries. We supply, so to speak, leading media of the Western world with our analysis on what happens here in this wider region.
Would you suggest, and earlier you mentioned that now suddenly there is also an influx of these, let's call them different think tanks, that are sponsored in many ways directly by specific governments, and then they more or less they serve like loud mouths or mouthpieces for the policies or the agendas of those governments, and the polarization where people will not take independent analysis as they used to in the past. How that affects, your center? Because you say you firmly said that we want to be independent and whatnot. I mean, you mentioned different countries. I lived in Hungary for many years. Hungarian government is quite well known as putting a lot of money into what seems on the surface like a think tank, but then basically serves their own interests. I think in Austria it was more in the political scene rather than having a similar pattern. But how does that influences both the debate, but as well your positioning, or as well your ability to maintain independence? Because at a certain point, some of those governments or some of those parties will say, "Hey, we are the paymasters. Why don't you skew this or skew that?" How does it work today?
Well, as I mentioned, we are a bit of a niche product, so we are not part of the national economic policy context, at least not in all topics that other institutes would cover. There are some issues particularly where the European level overlaps with national level. So, for instance, in terms of fiscal policy, we have very clear opinions about that, but maybe not everyone shares also on the national level. So these are things, but we are really trying to discuss things also with journalists, to be present in media, to have events also, to directly communicate to the broad public, not just through the filters of media and in other institutions. We have events that are both in presence as well as online. I think all of this is part of a bigger package, diversification of the customers in terms of research projects. Very important goal of ours. We have basically on average 70 to 80 projects running at any point in time. And basically that means something like 50, 60 customers who are financing these projects. So this is really a very broad group of supporters. And I have to say, we haven't experienced really anyone trying to tell us, look, you're not allowed to publish that, this or that. So, I mean, I think we are maybe lucky that we have a certain reputation, that we have a brand, so to speak, that the people on the international level trust us. We are in direct contact with important directorate generals from the European Commission. We are regularly invited in Brussels to support them also in developing strategies regarding EU enlargement, for instance, and so on. So I think we have that backing from that international level that helps us on also the national level or other levels, but there could be potentially pressures coming. So, but we observe obviously also our colleagues in the region. We have a very strong network in the region. We have friends and colleagues in the respective institutes in all the countries, and obviously particularly the colleagues in Hungary for many, many years are having huge problems. And I mean, we try to support as much as we obviously can to somehow help them, which is difficult, obviously. Cooperation in international projects for the European Commission is one way to help also each other to be a community. And I think in a way that's also part of the idea and structure, maybe not intentionally, but indirectly. If you run for EU research grants, then you have to have a consortium of 6, 7, 8, sometimes 12 different institutions where you also, in a way, share burden, share the risk of applying and cooperate, and thereby also create a stronger network Europe-wide.
Mario, let me try to bring this conversation about the your think tank in particular to a bit of a close with this lighter side question on if you could describe it in a song, what song would that be?
Yeah, I'm a bit boring on that because, again, Vienna is at the center of everything. I would say it's Billy Joel's song Vienna that describes, in a way, a bit of an old city where life is easier, maybe not so stressful. I mean, it's a bit of a cliche. It's maybe not completely true, but on the other hand, if you trust many of those global indexes and evaluations of city life quality, in Vienna is among the top 3, basically, in any of those rankings. And I think particularly for people who love classical arts, classical music, Central European food, it is a very open city for people coming from the whole region. If you enter public transport, which is very good in Vienna, you hear people from everywhere, languages, dozens of languages just in one carriage. So it is a city that is, I think, very good for the research we do, because people from the region are living there. They bring their language, knowledge, their networks with us. And basically we also see that it is an interesting place to work. That's why our labor market for hiring people is basically global, because people want to come to Vienna. So that is a nice add-on to the whole package of the Institute, I think. There are giants that we are building on also with regard to economics, as was mentioned already earlier, but also sociology, the sciences in general. So I think it is something we are very much indebted to, and we want to contribute to actually keep up the tradition, which was in many ways almost completely destroyed during the Holocaust, for instance, and other authoritarian movements that have caused huge catastrophes in this region, which is very much shifting around from decade to decade. But yeah, it's at the same time a very interesting surrounding and enriching intellectually, I think, to deal with problems with the fragmented structures of institutions, states, societies in general.
And Mario, if I can probe a little bit, because this is a conversation we've had with other think tanks and other think tank leaders, what you're describing is probably very true, that it's a great place to do the research. It's a great place, as you say, to have a kind of wide perspective from the whole region, to get inputs. It's a safe space as well to do the research, especially in a region where doing policy research work can actually be dangerous. But then, does that play against the ability to be influential? Because a lot of the influence is happening in a increasingly local, increasingly sectarian, increasingly politicized micro spaces, right? At the national, subnational level. And battles are being fought very, very locally. I don't know if this is a concern, right? You have the space to create a great paper, but maybe you lose the connections to that local fight.
That's absolutely correct. Obviously, I mean, the sheer fact that Central East and Southeast Europe within 100 years has basically moved from, broadly speaking, 3 countries to 23.
Yeah.
In itself is obviously a fragmentation of the political space. At the same time, you have this counterbalancing activity of the European integration process, where actually most societies are actually heading to. Replicating, as scholars are analyzing a little bit, the Habsburg Empire in some ways of a layered sovereignty, of different layers of sovereignty, which is shared among nation states. And in this environment, yeah, it's not so easy to bring through the policy advice. So we, at the same time, it's again good to be in Vienna because it's also a logistical hub. We can organize conferences in Vienna where everyone can easily come to Vienna. It's much more difficult to travel from, I don't know, Pristina to Sarajevo than everyone coming to Vienna, and we have a nice conference here. But also for us, it's obviously very easy. There are daily several flights to all these places, which otherwise are not high ranking in global transport networks, where we can meet our research partners, local governments, for which we sometimes present our research. And at the same time, yeah, we are not in Brussels. We are not in the center of EU policy. Another thing, this is sometimes a problem. Obviously, we know, I think everyone who is running for the EU project knows it's very good to have at least one partner from Belgium, Netherlands, or Luxembourg, because I mean, they are just very close in personal terms, very close to the decision makers in Brussels. So clearly they have an advantage in terms of knowledge. What are the hot topics right at the moment when they go out with people from the Commission for a beer in downtown Brussels? I mean, this is something it's difficult for us to compensate. We try to be often in Brussels, have also events in Brussels, talk to the people in the Commission. So that is something high on our agenda. We would like to do more. It's obviously also a resource question. But it is, we are fully aware of that. And we try to make the best out of it. Yeah, we are obviously not CEPs in Brussels, but we serve in a way still the European Commission with a perspective that comes a bit from the periphery of Europe, that brings in topics which are maybe not yet that important to Western Europe, but will certainly become very important. So I'm just thinking about the demographic change that is so much stronger in Eastern Europe, that also necessitates in some cases to, for instance, go fully into digital, for instance, in the Baltic countries, very interesting laboratories of the future of economic development and structural change. You know, why in Germany they now start to get rid of the fax machine. Ukraine and Estonia, out of necessity, have basically transformed their public governance structure into a almost fully digital system. You know, so I mean, there is a lot, I think, that also other parts of the world can learn from this region, and the other way around. I mean, it's not a one-way thing, and I think taking all together, I think we are quite happy that we are where we are and that we have this specific perspective, both historically as well as geographically, and also with a mix of different institutional backgrounds that we can offer both to Central East and Southeast Europe, but also to Austria, Germany, to the European Union at large, but also to the global audience that we are serving.
Thanks, Mario, and also thank you for mentioning fax machine. It's still a thing in Germany and Berlin where I live. But in addition to what you were mentioning, I think as well the necessity, often curiosity. I think, you know, from Vienna and onwards, you know, east and southern, there's a lot of curiosity that people have exhibit with the opening of in a way of their world. We spoke a lot about policy, about economics, analysis. You made a fantastic advertisement for one of my favorite European cities, Vienna, with the movie Third Man and then Billy Joel's song. But let's move a bit to you personally. We also like these conversations because then we ask the leaders of think tanks about them and their own, not only trajectory, as you mentioned at the beginning, but as well, you know, how this work impacted them. So in a way, in general, how working for a think tank has made an impact on you over these years, but also in specific, if you can think about the key decisions that you have to make that really have put in a sort of a stamp on that time for you personally.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of work. That is clear. Work doesn't stop in holidays or weekends, evenings. It just continues. Still, one has to find also time when you just deal with something completely different. I think that is an important thing that I probably had only to learn after a while. Even if it's just a little bit, there needs to be some space for individuals to just think out of the box, out of the current affairs, to also gain some insights. I'm now listening to, for instance, to a podcast of the history of the Byzantine Empire. It's incredibly interesting to see how over 1,000 years people have had a little bit different, but in some cases also very similar problems than what today is at stake, you know. So it's, I think, interesting to change sometimes a little bit the perspective. Otherwise, it's obviously a lot of work with people. This is our main, if I may say as an economist, it's not a nice word, but resource, basically. This is our input. If I connect that to the digital transformation that the whole world is experiencing currently, there are a lot of challenges. It's a lot of unknown terrain that we are exploring here together. With all the knowledge that I have now, I would have made a number of different decisions in the past, that is clear. But I think one important decision that we collectively made was to not only have passively experienced the digital transformation in the world, but to actually also implement a very broad digital transformation at the Institute. It was not easy, it was difficult. The start was very difficult for us. We finally have managed to transform a lot of infrastructure, software, ways how we work together. And we are still in that process that probably will never really end, as obviously artificial intelligence is a huge issue. We must be very careful how to really use it. We are still in an experimental phase. We are organizing training for our colleagues. I think it's very important to follow up with all the new possibilities in infrastructure with actually also training, to discuss things, to discuss best practice, to have this high on the agenda. So this whole digital transformation thing is a very important thing. I already mentioned also that speaking with media, with the broad public on a maybe more focused way, think about what are really your messages, what is the main outcome of your research. That is something we had to learn. Yeah, it was a bit hard, the hard way to learn it. But I think we are on a very good way there as well. And yeah, we want to support further European integration. If you wish, this is we are a bit of a structural change European Integration Institute, if you put it in a more abstract way. Yeah. We want to contribute to that peaceful development of Europe, which at the moment is under threat, obviously, from many, many sides, inside, outside, technology-wise and so on. It's not an easy surrounding, but we try to support the broad public with information. Everyone has to know where we stand, what is the situation, but also with policy advice, which is not just standard mainstream policy advice, but sometimes we also feel like we need to have some blue sky ideas to say, look, I mean, there are examples in the world of how people did bigger changes when they faced huge crisis. And I think we are right at that point in time where just tinkering a little bit here and there is maybe not enough, where actually our societies, our democratic societies are under threat, and we have to do something.
Mario, thank you very much for this. Let's finish this conversation by looking into the future. And I wonder if you can briefly think about, what do you think the future holds for think tanks in general? Are they under threat? Or, are we going to see new models coming up? What do you think will happen with think tanks in the future?
Yeah, I think these old school think tanks that have a mixed financing from the public predominantly, and projects which again international organizations, public bodies are financing, that work is now more difficult than it used to be. We can't shield our societies and our operations at the institutes from what is going on in the world. But at the same time, obviously, it's a huge opportunity to find new forms of activity, new ways how to do research. I'm thinking again about digital solutions, do things more efficiently, find those who are still interested in global public goods. So I think there is a lot of foundations coming out on the scene that are ready to finance very interesting research, networking, and are also happy to promote that research. We are doing a lot, obviously, on issues of geopolitics, geoeconomics. We were invited to the Munich Security Conference by a foundation. I don't think anyone else would have taken us there, but a powerful foundation that really has a strong interest in these issues and wants to inform policy and decision makers, I think. And that is obviously, it's a bit different than it used to be. Yeah, we have to constantly adapt, think about also what would foundations like to do research on. And they want to change the world a little bit. They want maybe also this a little bit more blue sky ideas and not just the mainstream that was ad nauseam published in some of the institutions that actually are now having a problem with their existence. Actually, if I think about how the United States of America and President Trump are treating international organizations, I mean, they have their own big problems there, and that again will also have repercussions obviously on the whole think tank, and has already on the whole think tank population throughout the world. So I think there will be a huge change in terms of who is financing public goods, and foundations clearly seem to be the rising star here. And as Western societies grow older, rich people become even richer, you have more and more funds that will end up at some point in some sort of a foundation that will hopefully fund research that is interesting for the broad public, or basically global public.
Yeah, and Mario, you talk a lot about the structured institutions. So this podcast is listened also by a lot of people that work for think tanks or consider working for think tanks, younger, not so young. What will be one piece of advice to these people about working with or working in think tanks?
Well, I have the feeling with young colleagues that there is little advice I can give them, but there is a lot of advice they can give me. I think young people are incredibly, they have CVs with, I don't know, such a list of prizes they made, of scholarships they had, of various very interesting new forms of research. So I think young people out there who have already a very detailed ideas of what they want to do research on and so on. And we are happy to host some of these people here at the Institute. But obviously, it's work. It's not always fun. One sometimes has to deal also with some people who are maybe a little bit more difficult than others, everywhere where the human factor comes in. It's not always just easygoing. We try to make the best out of it, but sometimes there are conflicts. It's normal. It's a human condition, I think. And then, we try to solve them together, try to be as transparent as possible. I think everyone who is young now obviously has to think about the whole issue of artificial intelligence. But we are very new to all of this. We still don't grasp the full potential effects that this will have on research as well. The longer I'm dealing with it, I'm fairly confident that good research will not go away. You can have a lot of very general mainstream speak perpetuated by artificial intelligence, but to really develop, to actually really analyze data, to pose the right questions, and then to develop policy advice, which is non-standard, which tries to combine various issues, which obviously the large language models have not been able to learn on. That will stay there, I think. So there is a huge opportunity, I think, for young people to go into research, to do things they really love to do. And I mean, I'm just experimenting with AI and coding in Starter, for instance, things that I, in former times, probably had to use days, if not weeks and months, can now be solved in half a day, basically. And I have more time now to actually really develop the paper, the argument, the research questions, think about these things. And I think that is a huge opportunity for every one of us. And young people, although things are difficult, some of the jobs will not exist anymore. But I think in research, they will have a good chance. If anyone is there who is interested in the topics, check our website, get your email into our mailing list. If there is a job offer, we would be very happy to have you on board.
So there's still some hope, some future for future think tankers. That's great. Thank you, Mario. This has been a very interesting conversation.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody that is listening. And to listen to this and other podcasts in the series, please visit onthinktanks.org or wherever you listen to your podcasts. From Goran and me, goodbye.